Dr. White. I'll start with a land acknowledgement for the Archaeological Research Facility and then introduce our speaker if there are no other announcements. All right. I think we're not muted.
We're good.
No, I think we're good.
Yeah, we're good.
The Archaeological Research Facility is located in Huichin, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, who are successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. We acknowledge that this land remains of great importance to the Ohlone people and that the ARF community inherits a history of archaeological scholarship that has disturbed Ohlone ancestors and made attempts to erase living Ohlone people from the present and future of the land. It's therefore our collective responsibility to critically transform our archaeological inheritance and practice in support of Ohlone sovereignty and to hold the University of California accountable to the needs of all Native and Indigenous peoples. There are people in this room doing that work, and I think, pointing out again that it's our labors that make that happen, that makes it real, right? Today, we have our esteemed colleague, Dr. William White III, with us. There's nobody right now better versed in how what's going on with the pandemic and the real world have affected the way that we teach, the way that we learn, the way that we professionalize our students than Dr. White. And so I'm really looking forward to his insights from a long trajectory of work in the private sector and now the public sector doing this work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. White to give our brown bag today.
Next. All right. Yes, please. Thank you for that introduction. This talk came out, and there's a lot of stuff that's actually happened since I agreed to give a talk that's titled about how these changes that we're all living through that's still unfolding in front of our faces, how that's affected something like archaeological field school. So the talk has turned into much more of a qualitative conversation about the pathways that myself and some of my other colleagues who are teaching field schools in the United States, some of the things that we came up with. Some folks continued through the pandemic, others like myself had to stop. But in this process of talking to probably 12, 15 different folks who all were running field schools at the same time, I've noticed there's a couple of budding changes that they could really change the direction of how we teach archaeological field school in the United States. So I want to start off, with kind of a statement, my own personal interpretation of what entails archaeological field school, then my own experiences as a person who's taken field schools, taught at field schools, and then three of the main things that I see that will last with us after this, which is, a more emphasis on health and safety that's starting to come to the foreground, especially with mental health services, a new introduction or maybe a resurrection of previous service learning orientation and an emphasis on professionalism, and then this new thing that's happening where a lot of field schools are paying student stipends. But I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to talk about it. The folks here in this room, they're folks who are either running field schools, taking them, so I want us to have a conversation while we're all here together in this room. Okay, as far as my own experience, I looked up archaeological field school and saw 4 different horrible definitions. So I realized, it's all over the place what folks are, thinking of what it is, but at its core, it's learning how to do archaeology by doing archaeology. So working with other folks who are skilled with archaeology, students get a chance to actually practice the things that they read about in class and get kind of a behind the scenes view of knowledge production, how we are getting the data that we're using for the different things that we talk about. Of course, those of us who are working at universities, research, that's a core piece of this entire thing. So students end up playing a participatory role in the production of research and helping instructors and the anthropology departments fulfill some of their important goals of conducting research that matters to archaeologists in the present. Then, of course, this ends up being the closest simulation that students will ever have of what it is to be a professional archaeologist. And those who have taught field schools or been around them know that, all of the folks that go into it, they're interested, very interested in archaeology. But in the process of being on field school, many realized that that wasn't what they actually wanted to do with their career, and that that's as far as they ever get. That's as close as they get to being a professional archaeologist. But for archaeology in general in the United States, this ends up being the training that folks get in the university that employers are most looking for. And so you end up seeing a lot of job posts that really have restrictions that they're just looking for folks who have done a field school. It ends up being a limiting factor in a lot of ways for some people's careers when they can't get an archaeological field school, because government agencies and companies know that this is the closest thing that a lot of people get to doing archaeology. And then of course it turns into a rite of passage, like I was saying before. Folks who want to do archaeology, they tend to enjoy archaeological field school. Those who don't go on to do other things. I mean, it's not as simple as that, but folks who have go on to become archaeologists, professors, work in companies, the vast majority of us did an archaeological field school at some point. And it ends up being this kind of transformable or transformable transformational, a transformation in your own personal career and your own psychology, that you realize that this is the kind of work that you'd really like to do. So there's benefits and drawbacks, but this is what I really think these 4 major aspects of doing archaeological field schools. So the other thing, going back to research, the field schools end up following these very similar, frameworks. And this is, somewhat universal, where there's a site or an area or a location or some kind of place that could have archaeological data that scholars are interested in. And they're interested in it enough that they are going to set up a research program. So these change in all different kinds of, research goals and opportunities that are provided and limitations on the landscape. But we all start with this place that could have archaeological data. And then scholars will sit together and they'll think about research questions in some kind of way. They'll create some kind of research design. There's something they want to know that also helps them think about the methods they'll use to collect that data. They put those methods together. We all start off with an idea. Sometimes it goes sideways after we've already been out there for a little while, but we all start off with a plan of what we're going to do out there, some kind of approach, a plan of work. And then here's where the students really come into the fore. They help collect the data. They're one of the ones who are there on the ground. This is a lot of times the main thing that ends up coming from an archaeological field school. Sometimes students are also involved in the processing of those items. But a lot of times that back-end processing ends up going back to the university, and then at the end there's some kind of result, something that's published, right? So in this system, which is the fully functional way of doing archaeological research, one of the things that ends up happening with field school is there's a lot of focus on the digging part, where the students end up being involved primarily in the excavation and being there on site. Even if they're not purely doing excavation all day long, they're at the site, they are doing survey. If they're going to process the artifacts on site, then students will be involved in that. But what they really miss is all this other piece, these other huge pieces that are really important in the archaeological process. And so, one thing that could potentially happen, and I don't really talk about how it impacted COVID-19, but I want to put this out to folks, is that there's opportunities in all these different other phases for students to be involved that don't involve being out actually in the field. Because one of the things that happened during the pandemic is we came back home, and if you were going to do a field school, the commuter field school was the most functional one that you could do, because a lot of our international ones were shut down from the United States. We have an opportunity here in all these different other phases for students to be involved, even though we don't always call it archaeological field school. The other thing that ends up happening is when we have this emphasis purely on the digging, there's a huge universe of folks that can't go out and do excavation, that either can't come to the place, they have many other obligations, or they're differently abled, and excavating and doing the kind of stuff that you do in the field is not something that their bodies can do. So all those folks who want to do archaeology, because the emphasis is on the digging, able-bodied folks end up being the ones who really get to do that. Okay, I started to really think about my own experience and found that through these many years, even the field schools I teach, unavoidably, I'm replicating many of these things that I'd like to see change. I think everyone in the world is happy that there's no photos of my field school and of me being there. It was on paper photos, so they don't really exist, right? I I took my field school in 2000, and it was in rural northeastern Oklahoma, and basically every single day was 90 degrees or so, and I dug through a chip sealed driveway and loved it. I had a blast, man. It was way better than the job that I had at the time. It was the only job I ever did that I didn't want to quit the very first minute I showed up to work. And I realized that I should really give it a strong try. There were about 14 of us. I'm the only one 23 years later that's doing archaeology. None of the other ones. Many also went on to graduate school, got their masters. None of them are doing archaeology anymore. I was invited to be part of NSF REU dig at New Philadelphia. Now it's a National Historic Landscape. At the time, it was an archaeological site. And I was one of the crew chiefs that worked with some other students from, they were from all over, from Miami, from Missouri, from Illinois. And I was helping with some excavations there. This thing, 6 weeks, I funded it on a couple different credit cards. You know, stopped my lease of my apartment, moved my stuff into my parents' garage, parked my car in front of my mom's house, and went to Illinois for 6 weeks, and had to restart my whole life again when that was over. For this one here, I was still a master's student, but I was working at a Ferry Farm, George Washington's Ferry Farm, in Fredericksburg, Virginia. I was fortunate at that time because I had some friends. Actually, my field school teacher from 2004 let me stay in her closet in Fredericksburg. It was a quite large closet. It was a walk-in, right? So I got to live in downtown Fredericksburg for 4 months and teach 2 different archaeological field schools that came through there. And this time I got rid of my lease back in Idaho, but I could at least feed myself doing archaeology. And then the other one here, when I was a PhD student, years later, I did another field school and public archaeology project. That time I didn't have to use credit cards, I used student loans. Right? So there's a lot of things in common here. Stop your life all the way, get debt, go to a place that's not your house, and do archaeology. That's been the theme, and that's also been the biggest limitation in field schools. Now, this stuff was possible back then, but then there was the other variable of the pandemic that stopped that travel aspect, right? From all these different things, you know, what did I learn about that? I just learned how to dig. We didn't spend a lot of time doing, you know, survey. I didn't spend a lot of time post-processing stuff. In the sun, that was my job. I was out there with students, and we learned how to do archaeological excavation and recover artifacts. Of course, when the mercury cracks 95 degrees in Virginia, you're going to have to figure out something about yourself and how to work together. And on these other ones, I did really learn how to work with people in these adverse conditions, which later on, going on to do archaeology and work outside, understanding how the weather and all these different things affect folks, and learning how to identify the strengths and the limitations of others and really work together as a crew to get a job done. This is something that really, it carries on into a lot of different workplaces, and we don't really emphasize it. And then the personal growth that happens when you go from your home to be with a dozen other people in another place where you don't know anyone, trying to figure that all out while showing up to work and all the other physical limitations, that other kind of personal growth, it really makes kind of a resilient individual. And so even if all you're doing is spending your time learning how to excavate, everyone who's going on to archaeological field school, whether they go on to do archaeology or not, they're also learning all these valuable workplace skills that sometimes we don't really let folks know that they're getting those, right? So then, the old model, which I'm starting to see that kind of come back again as COVID, wanes down and folks' limitations because of the pandemic start to wane. I'm starting to see kind of the recreation of the same model where, students come to me and say they don't have $7,000 or $3,600 to go to, another place and do an excavation. It's getting more expensive for researchers as well. I mean, it's not any cheaper to make all the reservations and all the arrangements in other countries and in other states. All of that's getting more expensive. So this is an absolute problem, right? The other thing, cultural resources folks talk for a long time about, that we're not teaching the kind of things that people need. And I have a response to that later on record, I'll share that with them. But there's no way to, you know, for students to really know what they're going to learn out there. There's no way for them to predict how they will learn how to, like, you know, what are they going to experience. And you never know if you'll end up in a situation where your job is to stand there and talk to tourists and read a pamphlet to people all day long, or sit in a trench and excavate all day long, you know, with breaks for food. There's no real way for folks to know. And there's also no way to, you know, figure out if instructors can actually teach. I mean, this is a huge problem with universities just in general. We're not always taught how to teach. And so there's not the same level of communication and learning that happen at every field school. Then of course, you know, the emphasis on digging, and one of my big things is I would wish for folks to try to open up the doorways for students to be involved with the other pathways. And then of course that compounds the lack of diversity. And one of the things that the pandemic did do is caused a lot of people to rethink going to college, and people of lower income, lower socioeconomic status, people of color, many of them have decided that going to college wasn't something that they want to do. And when you add on the cost of this and no guarantee that you'll learn what's going to get you a job, it actually makes it much more difficult to increase diversity among field school students. So after teaching these field schools, you know, one of the things that I really want students to know when they go out is that, you know, this is going to change the way you think about the world. You know, this isn't like a normal job that most of you are going to have in the future. Not everybody's going to do this for a job, but the other goal is for folks to care about antiquity and heritage, because as citizens of the world, no matter where you live, you're paying for historic preservation. And you're also responsible for passing these things on to future generations, whether you're an archaeologist or not. But then the other thing too is that it can be damaging. You know, the student loans that I took out to do that PhD dig are still sitting there. And it took me, you know, 7 months to pay off 2 credit cards so that I could go to Illinois and dig. That's an absolute real thing. And that was just straight finances there of someone trying to do something. If I hadn't had that experience early that made me think that it was a good idea, a good bet to do that, I probably would have been reluctant to spend that money on that kind of stuff, right? But then there's also a whole universe of other things too, as we all move through the pandemic and we really start to process what just happened to us for the last couple of years. There's all kinds of things that we're going to see happen that none of us have ever seen happen before, and none of us are necessarily capable of handling. But knowing that that's a potential is a huge thing, especially when you're taking students out into the field. Okay, we've got a short timeline here, right? What this timeline does is talk about events that affected us all in so many different ways. This thing still isn't over. Our entire world that we once bet on things progressing in a certain order, they went in a different direction, an unpredictable way, right? From the very first positive case in China, it was only a few months before we got to the point where people in the United States, US citizens, were not supposed to leave the country. At that point, when it comes to field schools, most of the folks who had a field school plan were canceling the plans as schools shut down, as we all went remote, especially after that 30 days. I don't know, folks who had kids remember when they said, yeah, just have your kids go home, you know, in a couple of weeks, when this all blows over, after this flu's over, we'll open school back up. My kids didn't go back to school for 2 semesters. You know, so that is a huge thing that happened. And our country had these different quarantine and entry rules, so that if you left the country, you had these different rules, these different things, and you couldn't necessarily know what they were going to be as they changed as the pandemic grew, right? Within a few months, we had almost 20,000 people dead in the United States, 500,000 people infected. Within a few more months after that, millions of people are infected in the United States. And at that point, all the shutdowns and everything, you start to see all kinds of stuff happen. Folks were hoarding resources. Folks were running out of food to eat. They had no money. Folks were fighting the mask mandates, fighting back in all different kinds of ways. There were race riots and then counter riots that ended up in violence. If you remember that summer of 2020, if you think back on it, you know, you can see that archaeological field school was one of the last things that anyone was really thinking about. As we move forward, we have the glimmers of hope here in the vaccines, After 1 million people in the world have died in the United States during the surge, 100,000 people a day are getting confirmed COVID cases. And of course, these numbers are only the people who were tracked. That's not all of the people who actually got COVID. By this time, we start to see these travel restrictions change, the vaccines start coming out. By this point, many of us think maybe we can go back and do field research. It didn't work out for every single person, right? We still ended up having a lot of different travel changes and stuff into the winter. And we also have to deal with the fact that many of our relatives, friends are passing away or getting sick of COVID. So these things continued rippling. They're still rippling through our society, right? As we sit today, we've got almost 7 million people around the world that passed away of COVID-related deaths. There's a lot of people, families, students, communities that have been adversely affected by this. And that's something that we got to keep in our mind as we move forward, as we really start to think about doing the things that we used to do. Okay, so I'm moving into the last few slides here, but I want to talk about some things that I've noticed from my own conversations with other scholars about some of the things that really changed because of the pandemic. Okay, so the first one here, health and safety is not just a side thing or a first aid kit of Band-Aids. To do archaeology during the pandemic, these health and safety rules that we had for many, many years in cultural resources, they become an integral part to businesses staying open. And we look to a lot of those folks to help figure out our own COVID protocols for field schools. So health and safety plans start to add on. So folks who didn't know, there's already a field safety manual for the University of California system that you're supposed to work with the folks in risk management to communicate what your field program is going to be, to identify risks. And I've been working with the health and safety folks to talk about archaeology for quite a while. It's one of those activities that falls outside of the normal range of what they're used to dealing with. And so we always have to renegotiate and consider what's going on. But we learned a lot from the companies that were considered essential businesses as they tried to continue construction in the United States. All these things like cultural resources become essential businesses. And so the companies who already have health and safety plans, they work with their occupational hygienists to create these protocols that are designed to minimize the spread of COVID-19. We also start to see this go into archaeological field schools, those who stay open during the pandemic. So I talked with quite a few cultural resources principal investigators about what they were doing, how they were handling it. But probably the one that shaped me the most was the work that they were doing at James Madison's Montpelier. Now, Matt Reeve and the folks at Montpelier, they continued their entire field school through the pandemic. And they developed protocols for folks to be able to stay safe from each other. That involved checking, that involved hygiene at the work site. This is a YouTube video that's produced by Montpelier that goes down through this checklist, this framework that they created for COVID. This is the framework that the SBA and we took pieces of that and added that to our protocols for COVID when we started back up in the field again. So, you know, this already existed as part of universities. We start to see more of this kind of stuff come out. There's a thematic volume here in Advances in Archaeological Practice that talks about this, you know, in quite detail. They cover COVID responses, but also mental health and other health and safety responses, specifically for archaeologists who are taking students in the field. And then if you work at UC Berkeley, we've got an excellent health and safety organization here that can help work through the field safety manual to make sure that you are in compliance with university protocols, but also with risk management, so that you're not placing the university in liability by being out of sync with what the university tells us to keep students safe in the field. Okay, so the other thing, like I mentioned before, with travel being shut down or more difficult, many field schools that stayed open just moved them closer to home. And within that space, they had a chance to connect with communities and do kind of a service learning orientation. So commuter field schools, like the one that the ARF did last summer, they really kind of become the pathway for a lot of students to continue doing field school during the pandemic, because each night folks can go home and all the things that, all the health and safety planning that's required with folks staying at hotels or with Airbnbs, that changes, and you can have, you know, students go home to their houses, they stay as safe as they can, and then you just work on the workplace as being the site where you're managing the risk of spreading COVID. And also I talked with Stacy Camp at Michigan State quite a bit, because she also continued their campus archaeology program through the pandemic. The third thing that I'm starting to see, and this is really just a thing that's beginning to grow, but I can see where this is a pathway to address many of the concerns that are going on in archaeology. But you know, having students become paid interns rather than them paying, like I had so many times, to go do archaeology. So obviously, you know, this isn't something that everyone can do, but having these kind of internships to offset the costs of going to the field school, it could really be a game changer, especially for students who don't have as much money, or people coming from different backgrounds, folks who it's a real huge sell to try to convince them that archaeology is a real job instead of just some vacation thing that you did, right? So that can be a really huge place to step forward for underrepresented groups. The work at Fort Mose between the National Park Service and I can't remember which Florida university, I'll get it wrong. They also followed the model of using the grant money to provide stipends to help students be able to afford going to the field school. Then the other thing too is thinking about, like I said, those other skills that folks learn at field school and how they're applicable in many different industries, right? Once again, if we're able to include students in these other aspects, they are learning these kind of research skills, they are learning mapping, they are learning planning and other kinds of things that they matter in a lot of different industries, right? So focusing on the curriculum so that they learn the kind of skills that they'll need. For folks who want to do archaeology, these two ones really, they've for many years, the Pima Community College, it provides an associate's degree, but they have a field archaeology program that's well known in Arizona. And then Archaeology Southwest, they ran out of funding this last year. They're applying for more, but for a long time they ran this preservation archaeology field school in conjunction with the University of Arizona, where they were working with tribes, working with on heritage land, on preserving these different sites, and training students how to do archaeology at the same time too. So, you know, it'd be awesome if we got to the point where this is what students say every time they take it. You know, this was the most awesome class that I took. I learned more here than anything else, right? Especially if I'm teaching it, the reviews, you know, it's really great for me to get that kind of a review. This is the greatest thing I've ever done. Well, you know, you're welcome. Okay, so, you know, moving forward, we have these complications still, but I feel like some of the things I saw during the pandemic are things that can really benefit moving forward, right? This health and safety thing, this is difficult for me to stress enough how important that is. And we got used to doing it during the pandemic, and like, just please don't let it go. Please stick with the health and safety thing. It's not just an afterthought. You know, moving forward, I'm doing some research with archaeologists who have been doing this for a long time about occupational health and, you know, physical therapy and stuff. Many of the like lifelong ailments that happen from doing this kind of work, I'm trying to figure out what companies are doing. There is a conversation about there not being enough archaeologists moving into the future. I feel like if you take care of the ones that you have so they don't break, you know, it seems like that's a, you know, functional way. But shoulder injuries, knee injuries, back, elbow, hands, all kinds of stuff, people work through pain. They are not necessarily taking care of it. They are not necessarily attending to their needs. Maybe if folks learn in college that this is something important moving forward, when they become later on careerists, they'll also know the importance of taking care of your body. This one, I don't really know what the solution for that could necessarily be, but I definitely think that having these closer programs, if folks want to continue teaching in the field, making sure you support those close ones is important. And I feel like a combo of stipends, scholarships, and then this most important thing right here, right? because most folks are going to go work in cultural resources. They need to come, I think after 50 plus years of cultural resources folks saying that we're not teaching the right thing, you know, they know where I'm at. I'll leave my email at the end. They can always come and help me teach the class. If I don't know how to do it, they can always figure it out, because sitting there waiting for us to do it for decades and it not happening and them keeping on saying that we're not doing it, you know, maybe now's the time. The other thing too of teaching more than just digging, right, and having the students involved at multiple phases, this one right here could definitely contribute to the service learning thing. And also it could definitely, you know, change the cost structure. Therefore, not all people have to be digging. Some people can be doing the research, some can be doing the analysis and writing, spreading it across multiple different weeks through the semester. That could really be a game changer for a lot of folks who have families or can't actually go and dig. The service learning, you know, the other thing, if you listen to the State of the Union last night, you can hear how our political system has changed, and the pandemic is prominent in that. The kind of language that I heard in the response to the thing, the language that was coming in the actual address, those are products of the last 2 or 3 years. The other product is all these different acts to try to change what's being taught in universities. And I feel like a lot of this is coming because many folks are not necessarily embedded in the community. And so these universities end up becoming this thing that adds to inequity rather than, you know, helping people out in the community. And so connecting with communities, you know, that's not just only for archaeology, that's to kind of try to save the university as a thing, right? And then on the very end, are you just adding diversity on there and saying that you're inclusive of folks, and then they show up to field school and it's a tragedy? Because that's the other thing that I end up hearing. It's not every single student, but I am hearing folks coming back from the field with stories that are not functional, and those folks are not going to go on to archaeology. And a lot of that comes from folks not doing the work in the background before they go out with students of color, and then that ends up happening, right? So in the end, you know, this thing that we just went through, it just changed everything, you know, the world that we live in. And, you know, archaeology field schools, they have a chance to move into something that becomes an attribute, or something that contributes to students' entire life while also contributing to communities. And we can, the beauty is we don't have to necessarily change that whole research arc. We already have that there. It's just changing the different people in the nodes that are doing the work. I mean, that's definitely one way that can really help moving forward. You know, field schools did go through the pandemic. There is a couple generations of folks that didn't get an archaeological field school because they were greatly diminished, but there's still thousands of folks through the pandemic who still found some kind of a way to get field training. And I also just want to stress that it'd be smart for us to use the things that we learned in the pandemic to help us move forward as we kind of come out of this thing. That's all I've got. I hope there's enough time for questions, but thank you very much for staying.
Oops, sorry. So thank you for the talk.
Yeah.
Super important. And I was just thinking about possibly two birds of.
Yeah,
Sorry about that.
Is that BB-8?
Yeah.
Anyway, BB, I don't speak your language. Sorry.
Man. All right. So yeah, so the two birds with one stone, the idea that, you know, you have some institutions that are creating certifications for professionalizing archaeologists, maybe community colleges. I'm thinking Cabrillo down the coast is a really good example of a famous place, but, you know, Sonoma State also be famous for kind of that pipeline. And then I'm hearing from my transfer students, who are always our most motivated, you know, killer students, who are saying, well, I didn't get the thing I needed to, you know, to be ready. Maybe the partnership that we make with those community colleges, finding those places where the certification, they've got the chops and the kind of nuts and bolts in place to get it done. We have some of these research relationships with community partners that are asking us for mandated, you know, community prioritized things. Maybe we find our way together to better nesting those two things, you know, to try to take care of the range of students and also the range of finances that we see tunneling in.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. And the other programs I cited there, Pima Community College, that's exactly what's going on. They have a relationship with Arizona State, the University of Arizona, Northern Arizona. There's folks who are cultural resources folks who are, part of the teaching faculty there. And so they work on these different projects and they try to make it so that those folks are hireable. And there's a pretty good track record of folks who just finish with their associates and go and be a field tech for a couple of years in Arizona for, just from that field school alone. And folks will see that on resumes, and they're interested in that person at the entry level right away. And then because it's community college, they've finished a couple of years for the 4-year school, so they're kind of halfway there. So if they decide to go on to another Arizona State school, once again, they accept those credits. So I see exactly, yeah. If we can build that kind of public-private thing when it comes to the field training, right?
Yeah. I think just as my last comment, as I pass this on to the tribal partners too, whose historic preservation divisions of TIPOs have been helping to professionalize our graduate students, hiring them even after helping them learn what is important in archaeology. Like that's another, thing that's happening that we do pretty well some places, but not everybody's doing. And that could be another way of thinking through how those relationships we build on those, because I think those tribal partners have been just killing it with how they've been teaching our students to do the real thing.
Yeah, I agree too. And the other thing too to remember is it doesn't have to be only local field schools, right? We can still maintain all those other ones that are happening far and abroad now that we can travel again. It doesn't have to be you just only go down the road from where you grew up, because there's a lot of folks who they want to work hard so that they can save up the money so they can go to Italy, they can go somewhere else, maybe even Illinois. It's something big for them to go and do it. They do want to do it. I'm not saying take away those opportunities, but just that this is a way that we can continue existing, getting that field training in a world that is getting more expensive and difficult. Yes, please.
Thank you for saying that, because I actually wanted to make that point. As someone who works primarily outside of the US, I think the biggest opportunity for change. I think the biggest opportunity for change is coming back to the issue of cost and really convincing the places that give us money to do research to restructure how we can spend that money. Because, what I think is really important is, a lot of that service-based work that you talk about and professionalization is important to do outside of the US as well, and building that community-based research. And right now it's really hard to get funding to do that. And, thinking about paying students overseas, so that they're not paying a ton of money has always been a big challenge. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for doing both the local stuff in tandem in the US alongside the stuff in local communities in the various places around the world that we work, that has the opportunity to really change how we think about training students and doing archaeology as a profession and as a community-based profession.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I'm glad you put that in there. Sometimes it's not about money. Sometimes it's what you're allowed to do with the money, right? And paying folks is a huge, they don't have that mechanism for a lot of grant funding organizations. And also for companies, what they're allowed to allocate company monies towards, right? Especially if they're a larger LLC or a corporation. I mean, they have to work through their board of directors to figure out if they can pay someone to do something that maybe doesn't contribute directly to the bottom line of the organization, right? So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And that's the other thing too about health and safety, but also the financial cost, the liability, right? Some institutions actually cannot afford insurance to insure your field program, especially a smaller school. They may not have a mechanism to cover you for insurance. And so, you're kind of fortunate if you're in the UC system, you've got this big organization that can cover you. But if you've got a smaller school, I can see how asking an archaeology professor to pick up their own insurance, account to cover a field school is like, first of all, the insurer would be like, what are you trying to cover here? Like, we don't have a policy for that. And then the archaeologist would be like, how much money do you want for the 6-week limited coverage insurance, right? Like, that's another huge hurdle to deal with and think about. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your convincing talk. I enjoyed it very much. So kind of continuing the conversation, flipping it around, I think one of the things that we may want to think is how we can really convince the rest of the world that archaeology is important to get through the COVID era and post-COVID era. So for what you presented, I think what we need to do in archaeology is very clear. So flipping it around, what can archaeology do for the current status with COVID and for the future?
Sure. The COVID one, I can't really address, I don't know how to address the unfolding health issue. I don't have really that much to say on that one, but the response, what kind of archaeology can we do to change the status quo? The thing of me doing this kind of archaeology with racialized communities, there's places like Idaho where I'm not really welcome to speak and the politicians are not interested in what I have to say. Trying to do a project in Idaho, I might have to actually apply for an exemption because it's one of the states that the University of California bans us getting reimbursed for costs going there, right? The political divide is like serious and it can be rippling through all this other stuff, right? Service learning of the UC Berkeley in the wrong town in California is not going to be welcome. My personal goal is to just try to be out in the community and connect with people. You know, I live here, so that would be the first step. And then to help other people in the towns where they're at, where they have even bigger obstacles to climb. Because I really, you know, the whisperings now of what's going on to the university system are concerning. 30 years from now, it could be the end of, you know, the United States being at the forefront of a lot of different things. If we have all these different rules where we can't say certain things in 38 states, how are you going to do a dig in a Native American community when you're not allowed to say their tribal name or even mention they exist, right? Or what would we do if we got into a situation where, because anthropology thinks of human theory, it's too woke to be taught, and therefore it should just not even in the state of whatever be taught anymore as a whole category of, and that's a thing that's, I mean, it's inching through, and with every bit, you know, we get a little corner cut off. I think that showing that these universities are not just these vacuums of money, they're a public service that gives back to the state. You know, what's better than having students and kids learn about their own grandparents and ancestry in their own town, right? Like that, I think, is one way that archaeology can actually do that.
Yeah. From my experience, you know, COVID actually revealed a lot of the issues that were hidden before COVID hit us. And for Japanese studies and Japanese archaeology, one of the things was visa restrictions that how to interact with foreign countries, like just like what Lisa said. And I think that was part of it, but in the bigger picture, the fact that the disparity between the rich and poor, those who have been underrepresented, were particularly heavily hit. And we had a talk by about disability in Japan, how that became much clearer under COVID.
Yeah.
And so I think what's happening in the world now, and with that understanding, what archaeology can do, I think that's something that I've been thinking about it, and we should really think it's not just one of the fields that have been affected, but really as part of anthropological archaeology, what can we do? I don't have an answer for it, but I think we should really think about it.
And I think that this is a thing that's just happening in real time. We adapt as the conditions change. It would be nice to have kind of an idea in the back of our head of what direction we're going, but knowing that it'll be difficult to get there. We've got two questions at the same time, Lisa. Oh, okay.
Yeah, pass it back.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for really provoking an important and really interesting conversation. My question is, how proactive are universities with the archaeology programs in actually reaching out to the community colleges? And specifically here, you know, in California, say even UC Berkeley in the Bay Area. I'm a big believer in community colleges, but in my experience with colleagues, you know, at elite institutions, community colleges are really down the food chain. Well, to me, it's one of the most exciting places and linkages that we can, work on. And, I work very closely with one up in Napa.
Yeah.
But I just I don't know how much genuine outreach there is and cultivating those relationships. A question.
Yeah, so I've only been here since 2017, so I don't know the track record of UC Berkeley. Half of the UC students are coming from community colleges. And then also the other thing to think about is each department is its own community. And so there's probably some folks who believe real strongly. There's other folks who are moving in a different direction, right? I don't know if every single person has to be reaching out to community colleges necessarily, if that's not their thing, because it'll be disingenuous and actually harm the overall effort. I think that our department is doing what it can to reach out to community colleges. There's a lot of limitations on those instructors on the other end because they're teaching a lot and they have a lot of obligations, and it's not easy to move around in the Bay Area from community to community. So us having like face-to-face time. But one of the things that's great, these talks being recorded and being able to reach out, we do reach out to our colleagues in the Bay Area. That's one way to communicate. And then our students, talking to them about what's going on in your community college, like what was it like where you came from, who were the instructors there? Do they have any connection here? Or did they even have the time to talk to any of us, right? I feel like that's, what we're doing. I don't see where there's any kind of programmatic partnership or anything like that, like, to build up. And even this thing I was talking about of the PIMA community, that's not a programmatic thing that students automatically get into ASU or Arizona if they went to that thing. They still have to apply. So I just don't know enough about the difference between the community college and the university system to know if we could ever build a thing like that, right?
The master plan, of course, for the university is that we must admit a certain percentage of students from transfer students. And as Jun said, anthropology is a favorite place to transfer in, and we have wonderful transfer students who are really motivated. And also there are what are called articulation agreements, whereby an introductory archaeology class, for example, taught at a community college, in order for a student to have that count as the introductory, say Anthro 2 here, their syllabus from their classes have to be reviewed by us. So there are these articulation agreements so that students know that if they take Intro to Archaeology at Diablo Valley College or whatever, that will be accepted when they transfer in. So there is quite a bit. And then there are special programs on campus specifically for transfer students to get adapted. And there's a whole outfit called Styles Hall on campus that does this. So, and yet it's interesting, I taught Tim's class the other day and went around the room and had people tell me a little bit about why they were taking this class, which appeared specialist because it was on hunter-gatherer archaeology. And many of them said, well, what I did, I'm a transfer student and I didn't have very specialized classes. They were really overgeneralized. So I'm very excited to be taking one that really zeroes in. So I think they recognize what they want to do as they move through the system when they're transfer students. But in terms of, and then of course we've set up a really good relationship, not with a community college, but with Cal State East Bay, for example, through personal connections with people, and they were part of the field school that the ARF did. So I think it will depend on personal relationships. But if somebody wants to get organized, it's easy to do. We know what the community colleges are. We could track the ones that send us the most students, for example, into anthropology and archaeology.
Oh, we've got a question in the back.
Right.
Should check the comments on the chat.
I didn't see any comments. You're next. I see you.
Yeah. Actually, it's more of a comment, which comes back to what Junko was saying, that, and actually the larger discussion, I think the reason why this is so complicated and it's really difficult to find solutions is that there's going to be so many different solutions. We're talking about, how we can talk about professionalizing archaeology and, you know, change the way the discipline is going within North America, how we can work with community college, but that's also a very American system.
Yeah.
And most archaeological projects, if we want to talk about the discipline as a profession globally, most archaeological projects are international in scope. And so you're actually dealing with a number of different academic systems and funding bodies, each of which has their own rules. And it just makes this an incredibly complicated thing. And then
Yeah.
in response to the pandemic, you know, what Junko mentioned for Japan, where I work in Jordan, it's a very different situation because one of Jordan's largest industries is tourism.
Mhm.
And their tourism depends on archaeology, depends on cultural heritage and archaeological projects being there and doing things.
Yeah.
And so not having them there was a huge blow to the national economy. And so there's a desperate desire to have projects back there for a variety of different reasons, which include simply being able to have this industry back again and bring people who spend money on other things
Yeah.
back into the country. And so I mean, there's just been so many different reactions to this pandemic
Yeah.
that are not common around the world that mean that one simple solution is never going to work everywhere.
And I wouldn't really want one solution. I'd want many solutions because there's many folks and many departments, right? So, yeah.
I guess this is also just a comment, but I'm a transfer. I transferred from Santa Monica College. And when I was there, I did well, I tried to get a certificate in CRM. And because of COVID, usually the way it would go would be you would go and do a field project with the professor that was leading it, and to Belize. However, that would have been completely student funded. So if you wanted
Yeah.
to go, it was like his project. It wasn't an official school. So if it hadn't been COVID and I wanted to go, I would have had to pay for my flights, for my
Yeah.
food, for my boarding. I think I would have had to sign things that said that he was not responsible for us in any way.
Wow.
And so even if, which I didn't think about at the time, but now I think about it, I'm like, that's basically free labor that he would have been getting out of us all for a credit for this certificate that it would have been like a 3-week program. And because of COVID, I didn't go. And I just did some class that went over CRM. But yeah, like if there had been some way for that to be funded through something else where the person didn't have to pay like $5,000 out of pocket in order to go off and do this thing. So even if it hadn't been COVID, I don't know if I would have gone, which I think is just a shame.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry that was your experience, and it's very similar to my own. It would be awesome if they had a local one there, right?
Yeah.
Nearby, so that folks who can go to the Belize one, so that, you know, folks get their opportunities, right? I didn't even mention the fact that a lot of these projects, I think job shadowing with cultural resources folks could, if you did it in the right way and tried to make college credit out of it, that actually could be a really functional way for folks who, you know, have families or they can't leave, or they just really want to go into it, or they want to just learn what it's like, because folks who have done field school know within the first, 72 hours, you kind of know what's going to happen to you, and you know who's going to make it and who's not having fun, right? So what if you had 72 hours of job shadow before you decide to spend $5,000 or, you know, do a local project, right? Yeah. Well, I mean, that funding thing, you know, like it's a lot of times not possible to pay US students in other countries, but we need to do the work there. And then a lot of times we're not setting them up in the local area for folks who could do this local one. And so it's like a mixture. It would be best if we had, you know, right size kind of situation where some folks were staying local and some folks we were supporting those who go far away. And then in the summer, when they weren't doing it, they support the local one. And that the department is just, you know, folks are moving through it in a kind of a productive and collaborative way, right?
Yeah, I just want to bring an international perspective. I did my first field school in Turkey, and we were paid we were insured through the state, and we were paid. And so when I had conversations with my friends, when I went to my second field school, which was Çatalhöyük, and of course, because I was a Turkish citizen, I had to be paid too. I had to be insured by the project as a Turkish national inside of it. And when I was speaking with my friends at the time, they were like, oh yeah, we have to pay to get here. And I was like, but you're working. So like, you're actually, this is labor. What you're doing is labor. And so I really like the idea that, you know, students as employees and sort of incorporating the reality that field schools are also places of labor. And it's not, I mean, it's not just knowledge. It can't, it's both.
Yeah.
It's not just professionalism. And I like the change in that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Is there, real quick, is there another class that's in here right now, or can we? All right, well, then let's keep rolling, my friends.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks so much for your talk. It was really interesting. And I have a question for you. It's
Sure.
something I've been thinking about for a long time. It is probably something that a lot of people have faced before, is that there's a sort of perceived dichotomy between what's seen as field research and academic research. And there's often a perceived chasm between those who are working particularly in public archaeology and CRM and who have experience in the field, and those who are working in research institutions like a university. And I think one, I don't think that chasm should exist, but I see students especially as getting caught in the middle of it, where especially if they're looking at field tech jobs in the future, they may be seen as, oh, you don't have the kind of experience, especially hands-on digging experience. You're just not adequate for this job, or vice versa. Oh, you have all the CRM experience, but you're not adequate for this university position. And so if you're talking about the using this opportunity to transform field schools and make them more holistic and make them more of a integral experience for students, how could we transform field schools so students aren't caught in the middle of that?
Well, the one thing that I'd say right there is CRMers teach the class too. If you think that you can do a better job, or that they're spending all these millions training everybody up, and that you know archaeology, but I don't, I got a shovel and I can get a hotel room and we can show up in the field together, and you can help teach, right? Because that, I'm getting to the point where I keep reading about how there's a shortage of archaeologists and universities aren't teaching this and that, and I can teach someone how to dig a shovel probe, I can teach them all the units and everything, but if they still think that, you know, you are an academic archaeologist, I can't change how they feel, right? And it seems like it's kind of a challenge, but in reality, I always try to get CRM folks to come out to work with students, and students who are trying to get a job work in the same units with CRM folks. They end up seeing what's going on there. And then I've had students get hired straight from the field school, right? So this is in Virginia, that place, the Ferry Farm, there were CRM folks from Virginia that went there. They knew the folks there. They saw us work. They talked with us. They found out who's graduating, and folks move on from those jobs, or from that field school right into jobs, right? So I agree that the chasm shouldn't exist, but in all fairness, it's not okay to just suck down $1 billion and then complain about how I didn't teach the people how to do it, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know what to say. I'm doing my best here, and tough, right? I mean, I was there. You got to teach people when they come in any which way. And so complaining about the low quality of people that are coming out of certain schools, or saying that certain schools are not good enough and all this other stuff, like, I think we're at, that's the end. Like, students aren't really going into CRM. They just got this money to do these infrastructure things. They're looking at thousands of people retiring, and they need thousands more. And they're looking at how many people are archaeology students and saying, oh, well, there's not enough. Well, the easiest way to convince a student that archaeology is a real career is to actually show them it's a job by paying them and getting them a job, right? Then they figure it out. So that's where that whole, the chasm, the beginning and end or whatever, they can say whatever they would like about CRM education and us preparing folks to work in the field, but there's always room for more. There's always room for them to come. And if I'm not doing it right, like I'd love to learn what right is. So please help me out. Please take an active role in something that you're saying is deficient, right? Remedy the problem. CL, please.
I'm just so glad you're talking about this because this is like hitting on so much of my experience and my struggle, I think, with my family who's just not ingrained at all in academia, and like was just as an undergrad, me trying to tell them like I need to do this if I even want to have a chance at this career was like, they were like, you're lying. Like, what are you saying? That makes no sense at all. My dad is just very practical. He's an accountant. And he was like, that makes no sense. Like the money makes no sense. And so for me to have to outsource and like work multiple jobs, go out for scholarships just to get there. And then I think that when I was there, it was like such a great experience because it proved to them how valuable it was, not just in terms of like experience, but I think in these kinds of connections that we don't talk about a lot, that is, it has a price to it in academia, right? Like I got letters of rec there that if I didn't have those experiences and make those connections, I would not be where I am today. I would not be getting my PhD at Berkeley. I wouldn't. And like, that's just reality. And I think that like these connections in academia and like using students for like time and not really, or favors, or like meeting them, but not really paying them for those things. It's almost so ingrained into the culture. And so kind of like, okay, well, I have to do this to make this connection with this person because it could be used for some sort of capital later, right? And that's, I think, really difficult when we live in a world that like costs money to exist and have a healthy body and like all of the things that we could have a conversation about that, right? But like, yeah, I think that's just so crazy to think about that I didn't realize at that age of like, what, 19, that I was making a connection that I would have too for like the rest of my life and like help secure my career in a lot of ways. Because at the institution I was for undergrad, a lot of the classes weren't taught by professors. They were taught by PhD students, and those students can't write letters of recommendation. So like these logistical things that I think like also gatekeeps academia from like having different types of people come on through and makes it really difficult. And I don't know how to explain a lot of this baggage with someone who's interested in pursuing this path when it's just, there's so much, I think, unspoken, that how do you have these conversations of this realities with students that don't know?
Yeah, I'm glad you shared all that. And I do feel like sharing is the first step, right? Because there is layer upon layer that we don't ever talk about. We have time for another question, or everybody's okay? Yes, please.
I want to say that collaboration with CRMRs happened in Japan in the 70s and 80s. Everybody was paid to do their excavations. And it was great in the 70s and 80s, but at the cost of large-scale environmental destruction. And it didn't last. That once the Japanese economy came down, we still have the system, kind of, but not nearly as good as it used to be. So what I see kind of happening in this country is that I see that, okay, we'll probably get more support, we might get paid, but it won't last. So how am I going to make a long-term plans with that? I think it's really important.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. And then also the funding too, like contingent on who you're recruiting for the field school and like the way that you spin it and everything, could be leaving out whole populations of folks, right? Is that it? That's the end? Okay.